your future research and looking at this through research fellowships. And I'm really glad that we've got three great people here joining us today to pass on all their ideas and their tips. So these are Anna Joy Drury from UCL, Lucy Roberts from Aarhus, and David Neave at the University of Manchester. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that you can see everyone here. And so let's just start. I'm not even going to give them instructions. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And so basically, if you could all one by one take a few moments to start by sort of introducing what you do, what your experience is with applying for fellowships, and what you're currently working on. So who wants to start?
I can go ahead. Okay, yeah, so I'm Anna Joy Drury. I'm currently Marie Skłodowska-Curie Research Fellow at UCL. So I'm a stable isotope geochemist and stratigrapher. Work a lot with marine sediments, looking at past climate changes. Yeah, I did my PhD at Imperial College in London, then moved to Bremen for initially a postdoc and then a research fellowship, and then came back to the UK on the Marie Curie Fellowship in 2019, on which I'm still poodling along, but coming to the final end stage of my fellowship. So yeah, so that's me.
Lucy, do you want to go next, just so we in the same order as the intros? I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Lucy Roberts. I'm currently a Marie Curie Fellow at Aarhus University. Prior to that, I did my PhD jointly at Queen Mary and at UCL in London. And then I did a postdoc at the University of Nottingham. Broadly interested in water quality and shallow lakes. So my current project is trying to establish a new method to reconstruct nutrient enrichment in shallow lakes.
So I'm David Neave. So I'm currently at the University of Manchester. So I'm a volcanologist, igneous petrologist, experimental petrologist, a range of different things in this sort of area. So I did my PhD in Cambridge, where I stayed for a short sort of 9-month postdoc split between Cambridge and British Antarctic Survey. And from then I moved to Hanover in Germany for a research fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for a couple of years. And then I stayed on in Germany in a position which is sort of a research grant and sort of a research fellowship funded by the DFG, so German Research Foundation. And from there, moved back to Manchester to take up an institutional fellowship funded by Manchester, which I'm nearly at the end of. But then a couple of years ago, I started a NERC independent research fellowship, also then at Manchester. And as well as those, I've had a couple of unsuccessful applications to other bodies and the same bodies. So there have been some successes there, but there have also been some notable failures as well, I'd add to that mix. Yeah, so that's where I am now.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so you can see a range of different fellowships and different fellowship experiences, and most people have spent some time doing things like postdocs or institutional fellowships beforehand. So one question we had was basically, how did you, and I'm going to paraphrase some of these questions, but how did you find out about the fellowships you applied for, and why did you apply for the role?
I think so. I think in my case, I'd done sort of in the first couple of years of my postdoc, made a bit of an Excel file after doing some Google searching. Went to a few early career events that sort of highlighted different fellowships, and I think word of mouth has played a big role as well, or talking with people at conferences about potential collaborations. Those have sort of been at least starting points to talk about what fellowships to look into, and then once I've maybe identified schemes to look at yeah, well, events like these, I guess, to try and see what I would, or what I could gain in terms of whether I'd be whether a fellowship scheme is relevant for me.
I think my experience was the same, that it was through meeting people for collaboration. And it was who is now who I'm working with at Aarhus, who suggested applying for Marie Curie. I think particularly because moving to Europe in Denmark, there were fewer schemes that you're eligible for as a non-Danish citizen to apply to. So it kind of narrowed down which fellowship scheme I would apply to quite nicely.
Yes, I suppose when I was finishing up my PhD, I was looking at what to do next, and it was very noticeable that in the final year of my PhD and just after, there were no postdocs advertised in the UK in high temperature geochemistry or petrology. So there was no postdoc that I could have applied for, you know, in any case, no matter how competitive. So I was interested in looking elsewhere. Some institutions like Cambridge, where I was, have some fellowships that are sort of targeted at people straight out of their PhDs, but I desperately wanted to move and see somewhere else, do something different. And options in the UK seemed relatively limited. And again, it's just luck plays a big role. My office mate at the time was Belgian. He'd come to the UK, had some fellowships, was also then interested in particularly doing experimental work in Germany. He applied for something. I was made aware of the Humboldt Foundation, which I wasn't aware of before, because you can get very blinkered in a particular national mindset, I think, and that gave me a sort of different opportunity to look for something slightly different. And then, you know, from then I became increasingly aware of the various options and started to apply for Panellists and Royal Society and NERC and other German schemes once I became more aware of things, just from chatting to people at conferences, meeting people, that kind of thing. But it was being aware of what options there were immediately out of a PhD or a short like a first postdoc. That was definitely the biggest uncertainty for me.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so I think, you know, there's different routes, right? But in the UK, there's certain obvious routes such as Royal Society or NERC, a slightly later career stage. And I think it's probably a case of trying to be a bit flexible and thinking about options at that slightly earlier career stage, especially for options abroad, because people in your lab group, people in your department will know about the UK schemes, but probably don't always know so much about the options abroad. So I think that's a really nice point. Okay, and so one other general question, because you're talking about moving into a fellowship, maybe from a PhD, but maybe after a postdoc or two in the first instance. Do you feel there are particular skills, sort of what skills have you needed for a fellowship compared to being a researcher doing a PhD or a postdoc? That may be a tricky one, so I don't know who wants to come in.
I guess being confident in maybe developing an idea of your own, and starting off with, I mean, for me, my first fellowship idea, sounds like my first pony, but my first fellowship idea came out of something that I'd written sort of towards the end of my PhD and future work. I then went away, did a postdoc, which helped build my confidence a little bit more in terms of and give me a bit more sort of stability and research experience to then feel in a more stable position or ready to put together an idea to write fellowships. At least that's one aspect that worked for me or helped me.
I think I've really learned the value of time management, especially going from, even though my PhD was quite independent, you know, I had a supervisor who was keeping an eye on my timeline, and then I did a postdoc on a really large UKRI grant that my time was quite managed, you know, into meetings and deadlines and work package targets, to then suddenly arriving at a desk with no one really having, you know, a guide for my time or any, you know, your own sort of objectives that you set on your own timeline, and carrying on previous postdoc work as well without, you know, in my last postdoc, they were good and allowed me time to write up PhD papers, but I always had it in mind that that wasn't my job. You know, I should do my job, and then any time extra I could spend on PhD work, I could. Whereas now, you know, it's up to you really how much time you split on previous research projects and new ones or current ones.
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest difference is finding an idea to motivate several years worth of research. So I had a lot of freedom during my PhD, and obviously that was sort of set by my supervisor, who progressively sort of backed off and let me find ideas and projects, but that was a sort of an idea that was like a paper or so, not a 2, 4, 5, 8 year project, depending on the fellowship that you're pursuing. And I think that was the biggest challenge, to find those ideas, at least to begin with. And I suppose my approach was using it as an opportunity to learn something new, to learn new skills. That was because my PhD was very much focused on sort of in situ microanalysis of rocks, lots of time looking at thin sections, doing analysis of, things like electron microprobe, SIMS, this kind of stuff. So I wanted to learn something new, and that took me in the direction of experimental petrology. So I could I could try and, it was a skill I wanted to learn to try and address things I couldn't do in my PhD because, the data weren't there. And that was maybe a route that I took to like finding some ideas and so forth. And once you start in that direction, maybe it becomes a bit easier to find other more expansive ideas, because especially as these first fellowships, you might be thinking of 2-3 years as it's a different scale of project from then a larger project, which might be 5+ years, which I was completely daunted at the prospect of trying to work out what to do for 5 years. At that earlier stage, working out something to do for 2 years was more manageable.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, so I think that again we're seeing here, right, that it's maybe a good way to try and start with a 2 or 3 year fellowship, or being involved in writing a research grant with someone that you work with before you maybe step up to try and apply for a 5-year or an 8-year fellowship. But anyway, that's good. Talking about coming up with an idea for something that's going to keep you busy for 5 years, that moves on nicely to the next sort of set of questions, which is really about how you came up with an idea and how you went about planning your fellowship. So I'll let David off now because he's already sort of answered this, but for the other two of you, sort of how did you come up with your project idea for your latest fellowship? How did that come about?
So yeah, I think for me, it's sort of, I forgot to mention this earlier, but David just mentioned writing research grants, and actually one thing that helped was the 3rd year of my postdoc in Germany. I'd come in and there'd been a really structured idea for the first 2 years, and then within the 2nd year we had to write the 3rd year grant of the and basically my boss let me do that and let me take the 3rd year in the direction that I was interested in, and that was really good training, really helpful to sort of then lay the foundation for getting used to grant writing. So that definitely helps, sort of co-writing a grant. And yeah, I think the fellowship I'm on now was came off the back of a paper from my PhD where we didn't have the material to kind of do what I wanted to do. And then I went on an expedition, and I got the material that I could do what I wanted to do. So that's where that idea sort of came out of this paper, where I had some quite nice data but couldn't quite make the best of it. And it raised some additional questions. So that's sort of where my fellowship came from, and even the fellowship grants I've been writing in the last year, so I've been going for more the 5-year NERC IRF and Royal Society ones. Those have likewise kind of come out of perhaps earlier papers, or bringing together different strands of my research, in addition to bringing in new material, which is maybe specifically related to the ocean drilling program, but that has been I've been quite lucky with participation in those expeditions, and then you sort of get some new material, and the questions kind of, as you're discussing and looking at what's available, have developed off the back of that as well.
Yeah, thanks. And I think the idea of getting new material, I mean, obviously the IODP is a good example for those of us that work on ocean sort of sediments and paleoclimate, but I can also see that applying to if you have scientific questions and you want to go and do field work in a particular region that you didn't have funding for in a PhD or in a postdoc project, to say, here's a really big question and let's go to this region. I need funding to go and collect these samples and do some field mapping and bring back these samples and analyze them geochemically, for example. So I can think that that could be more widely applicable as well. Lucy, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, for my Marie Curie, I think the idea was actually mostly from who I'm working with in Aarhus. They had worked previously at UCL and had discussed the possibility of using ostracod shell chemistry to do this work, but he has no expertise in that area and it had never happened. So then when I did my PhD and was looking for opportunities, the idea of that project came up again. And that's the other reason for choosing Marie Curie, because you have to show quite a strong training element to your grant. And he works very much on one side of my project and I work on the other. And now I have a year left of my Marie Curie, so I'm in the same position of starting to think, of new ideas, more ideas for maybe bigger, longer fellowships. And I think the ideas I've mainly had for those have come from actually being, in a department and environment that do specialize in slightly different things than I do, and that training element from the Marie Curie has really helped to think about things a bit differently and to add new elements into what I do and gaps where what I do could help other fields.
Yeah, so that the next question I had written down here was sort of along these lines. So I don't know, again, if everyone will want to answer, but it shows that the questions people are asking are going in the right directions, I guess. So yeah, sort of how did it, in terms of your fellowships, how did it relate to what you've done before, and or how was it different? Was it more of the same? Was it totally new? Was it a combination? How did that work out? And I guess, Lucy, you've sort of given a flavour of that already with your example, but maybe, I don't know if David or Anna Joy have something more to say in that direction.
Yeah, well, I guess I already sort of mentioned how at least my first move to Hanover for the Humboldt was to learn experimental petrology, basically in a lab that in a type of lab that doesn't exist in the UK. So it was a good opportunity, and some advice I'd been given by many people, including many people who've sat on things like the panel for NERC IRFs and the panel for Humboldts and the panels for ERC grants, is like or starting grants at least, like the training and like career and personal development aspect is something quite important in a fellowship, distinct from a research grant, perhaps. Like the fellowship grant is about developing the person as well as the project. So showing that through the grant, fellowship grant specifically, was quite important. So I guess, yeah, no, the Humboldt was to learn experimental petrology. And then like my NERC fellowship in Manchester was, I have these skills for my PhD and I have these skills for my, previous fellowships in Germany, but the project is heading in a new scientific direction. So the point we're looking at now is much more about redox and big scale geochemical cycling through the earth, through time, and well, related to the redox of magmas and that kind of thing. So it was a new topic direction, but showing how what I'd done before was building that, giving me the skills to then address what was for me a new kind of topic.
Yeah, I think that also sort of fits with my experience. I think everywhere I've gone with my postdoc, I moved there. I went to a group which specializes in stratigraphy, which I've then been able to take and combine with my PhD background to really inform both next fellowship applications I've been successful with. And I definitely, with the most recent round of applications I've done, I've also tried to deliberately go in a direction that's away from the late Miocene. Is a time period I've worked a huge amount on, almost exclusively to certain degrees. So I really have tried in the most recent round to try and push myself beyond that. And I guess I used a lot of different proxies, but to show like, yeah, I'm going to start something completely new. But I was also honest in the application there and saying, look, that's not an area I know a huge amount of, so I'm going to work with X, Y, Z to who are specialists in that to make sure that I can bring my knowledge and expertise in, but that I then don't, you know, have people to help me who've worked a lot on those time periods.
And yeah, so okay, fine. So that's like some really nice examples there, slightly different flavors. So just looking, one of the questions in the chat we can perhaps look at now as well, which is along the lines of sort of what makes the difference in an application to a Marie Curie fellowship, and it fits in with the question I have here, which is basically how could you make your project and or yourself stand out in your application?
For the Marie Curie, the university that I'm at, Aarhus University, organise a workshop for people who would like to apply for a Marie Curie fellowship to go to Aarhus, and they paid for me to go to Denmark, and there were very specific workshop sessions. So it's worth looking if you're interested in a certain place or collaborator, if they have those options. But one of the things that they told me at that workshop for the Marie Curie was to really think why the EU should fund your project specifically, more so than the German Foundation or NERC, or so mine links to EU policy, which was quite nice and easy to be able to weave in. But that I guess is one way, if you can make it very aligned to the EU priority, to stand out slightly more.
And I think that's something Lucy already mentioned, like the Marie Curie is designed as it's a two-way exchange, knowledge exchange, and a training fellowship, or maybe that's David, can't remember. But where yeah, so the idea is you bring in something new that will benefit the host, but the host can also should impart something new to you. You should get something out of it. So I think highlighting that is make sure you do that. And actually with the Marie Curie application, at least when I did it, I think you get 10 pages. And originally, coming from the DFG fellowships, which are very science focused, I was quite surprised. There's actually a lot, it's a broader application. So there's a lot about impact and your implementation, and that's at 50% of your score, and really your science and why you and why that host, that's only, I mean, it's still 50%, but that's 50% of your score. And then impact is 30% and implementation is 20%. So if you focus only on laying down your scientific idea, like, I guess you still need to do that very well, but it's also make sure you think more broadly and make sure that you also explain, hey, this is the implementation pathway that I see, or risks mitigation, or how you'll communicate. So think more broadly about how you'll make your science and your matter and be sort of not visible, sorry, not visual, visible, and yeah, beyond only focusing on the science idea. Like, make sure you look at the other aspects other than scientific excellence. That will always matter, but there's other aspects that they will look at in the proposals. So don't forget about them.
Yeah, I guess the Marie Curie is slightly distinct in terms of how it's weighting some of those aspects, which is maybe different from NERC or Royal Society. David, I don't think you've been involved in Marie Curie. Do you have any on that broader question of, how could you demonstrate that your project was unique? How did you stand out? Do you want to add something in that sense for these other fellowships?
Well, I suppose the point that I guess I would maybe highlight is the importance of making sure that the fellowship application is really well matched to the fellowship scheme, and trying to understand who your audience is and who you're writing for. Because, okay, you have to show you're the right person for that, but a large part of that is just, showing that you are meeting their kind of needs, their aims, whether that's like, and who you're writing it for. So like, NERC fellowships, you can be fairly sure there'll be one or two people on your specific panel who will know quite a lot about your field. You know, so as a volcanologist, there'll probably be on panel a volcanologist or two, or people who work on igneous rocks who actually really understand the science case behind that. Other fellowships, you know, so you are writing to a certain degree of like, it needs to be broadly understandable, but they also will have, you know, specific, they'll be invested in your ideas from a discipline point of view. Whereas for the Royal Society, for instance, you're writing to 50 physical scientists, and at least in the round that I was interviewed in, ultimately unsuccessfully, there were two geoscientists, and they were both biogeochemists. You know, so actually nothing to do with my discipline at all. So you kind of have to be aware that the different schemes will have kind of different audiences and different expectations and requirements. And this is information that, you know, past applicants, colleagues, people who, you know, people in your department who have sat on these panels or interviewed for them or applied to them before can provide that kind of information. But yeah, that, you know, you have to show that you're really good, you have to make sure that you're showing you're really good with respect to the criteria that they are looking for, not somebody else's criteria, basically, would be my thoughts.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So we'll come on in a moment to thinking about writing, which I'm sure is kind of going to be the main part of our second half of the session. Just before we do that, there were some questions about sort of choosing a host institution, and do you need a mentor there to support your application? Now, of course, this does differ according to the fellowship schemes, but perhaps those of you that have been involved in schemes where you did need a mentor might just want to say something about that.
Yeah, so I guess, well, the Marie Curie, they call it a supervisor, and they're definitely, yeah, you need that person in place. So I think that came out of a conference where I was discussing an idea with the person who turned into my supervisor for the fellowship, and she suggested, have you thought of various different schemes? And then I was a bit too afraid to go to the NERC one because of it being 5 years, but I could get my head around the 2-year Marie Curie, so I ended up applying for that one. But it came through sort of discussions at conferences.
So I guess I could say, yeah, so like the Alexander von Humboldt, you need a host for that, which would usually be the head of the institute you're applying to. And they obviously need to make an institutional commitment, as you do with many fellowships. They weren't really in a supervisory or managerial role. I guess they were just a senior academic at that place who could say, like, well, if this person turns up, they will get a desk and be allowed in the labs and that kind of thing. And I guess similar from a UK perspective, that research fellowships, like at least in Manchester, like any grant, they need head of department approval and a signed off internal peer review, and then sometimes another review by somebody else. So there will be people, but if you're making contact with that university, you know, the people there will be able to guide you through that process, I think. So yeah, I think that's just a case of reaching out to people in good time, especially because it's, I don't know, post-COVID backlog still means that things that used to take days to process are taking months to process sometimes. So
yeah, definitely doing that in good time is kind of the key thing, and being aware of what the department will need from you rather than leaving it to the last minute, which doesn't make a particularly good impression on a rushed department or a rushed head of department or whatever. All right, well, I think that's good for that. Let's move on to thinking about writing, which David has already just started to mention in terms of writing proposals. So the first question, because a lot of people at this stage, if you're looking to put together a fellowship proposal, have probably written a thesis, you've probably written a paper or two. How does, in terms of a mindset, how does writing a proposal differ from writing a manuscript, writing a paper?
I think the thing I've found hardest when I started was having, I think Anna sort of touched on this before, but having the confidence in the idea. and really selling it more than in a paper. I think it's what someone has said to me before: if you submit to Nature, don't put any buts or maybes. You have to be sold on that the idea will work, even though if it's risky. And also yourself. And Marie Curie has a fairly large paragraph about why it should be you and what you take to your institution. Just writing those parts I found the hardest.
Yes, I found sort of almost certainly seeing it a little bit as like problem, action, result. I know that's often something that you might get in an abstract, but that's been quite a useful structure to get myself started in terms of getting certainly the problem down, and definitely compared to papers, whereas you might in papers tone things down or be a little bit more realistic in interpreting your data. I would say in grants, not to be unrealistic, but to be a bit more kind of a bigger picture problem that you're relating and that you're going to kind of contribute to, and then kind of writing out in note form as problem, action, results as a starting point for the grant, for the different fellowship schemes. And reading the guidance notes, I would say, especially with the Marie Curie, the guidance notes, they seem to be very specific and yet sometimes repetitive. So I think it's also good to get some past examples. That can be really helpful to try and work out either how other people have structured it or how to interpret these subtly different kind of crib sheets that funding schemes sometimes provide you with.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with this approach around like being very clear about, here's a problem, here's why it's important, here's what we're going to do to address it, and here's where that will lead us. So everything is very much like, problem, a justification of why it's important, and saying how you'll address that. And that was the kind of core of how I built all the kind of applications up, really, or increasingly do so, because that's the most important bit, really, having really clear ideas and then a very clear statement on how you'll address that. And those kind of big picture statements are probably more important than actually many of the details. Obviously, the details need to be correct, but the person that they need to be correct for is you, not really for the reviewers or the panelists. And another really important piece of advice I think I've had was, again, different people will be reading it to different extents. So the reviewer will read the whole thing in detail and critique it. A panelist who looks at it in detail and kind of collates the reviewer's comments will probably read all of it reasonably. Many members of the panel might only read the abstract. So a really important thing was like, whoever reads it and however much they read needs to get exactly the same message. So the summary and the abstract need to tell you exactly the same information as the main bulk of the fellowship itself, so that everyone's on the same page. And to a degree that might seem like you're repeating yourself, but you're actually making it easier for the people who are assessing your fellowship. They're only ever going to read it once. It'll seem repetitive for you because you've read it 10,000 times and edited 10,000 drafts, but they're only going to read it once, maybe half an hour on the train on the way to Swindon to do the panel or whatever. So I think that helped. And that means you've also got a nice, neat, effectively half a page summary, which is the whole proposal, which you can then flesh out into the bigger one. I think that, so you can have the whole idea kind of packaged and then expand. That was my kind of strategy, at least.
Super. Yeah, I think those are some really, really great points, actually, really important points. One related point, thinking about how important it is to get across the message of the proposal in that sort of introduction or that first page. Do you have any specific tips on how you could write that so that it can be widely understood, so that, in David's case, it's not just going to be read by igneous petrologists, you want it to be understood more broadly? How did you find any useful tips for how you went about making it understandable to that broader audience?
Well, I guess just use as simple language as possible, basically, and just try and remove as much jargon as possible. And it'll seem simplistic to you, but what you're doing is helping other people understand. You know, it's highly likely that people looking at it will be like, they'll have done geology, you know, at least first, maybe second year in your, you know, they'll understand that kind of level for sure. But you can get into the detail later, I think. Did you have something else you wanted to follow up? You were kind of like, in the previous comment, it looked like you wanted to jump in.
Maybe, but I can't remember what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
Good start. Yeah, I think. Oh no, I do remember what I was going to say. I think what I was going to say with the previous thing, which I guess matters for this as well, is for me, it's always helped to kind of get it written so that it feels justified for me, and like the logic flows for myself, and I can get through it and understand, like, I've kind of rationally explained my thought process and what I want, and then to significantly cut it, because I tend to be quite lengthy, and also if need be reword it. But I normally also with these summaries, like, might start out with justifying it in a way that makes perfect sense to a specialist, but then simplifying it or rewriting it once I have that framework and know what I want to say, then rewriting it from the perspective of basically someone who's interested in science but doesn't have a background. And I know that there are these tools, like, I think 100 words, where you need to try and write what you do in the 100 or the 1,000 most common English language words. And there are tools that you can use online, or readability scores. It can certainly help to just, because you sometimes spend so long looking and you know what paleoceanography means, that you forget that maybe not everyone knows what paleoceanography means. So then these can be useful tools to sort of highlight which words might not be as common as you think they are.
I don't really have much to add to that, other than I think the importance of the abstract was really drilled into me as well. In the Marie Curie, that's often how they choose your reviewers, based purely on the abstract, and you're asked to choose disciplines that your project proposal falls under, and you rank them. I think there's 5, I can't really remember, but you know, like, really thinking about that, because they probably have a list of people who've done it before under, you know, ecology, and then getting the right words in your abstract that would lead them to a reviewer who would have, you know, interest in your proposal, rather than, you know, someone who's maybe on the periphery. It gives you a better chance if your reviewer is at least in the ballpark area.
Perfect. So how did you, I mean, having written a proposal, having focused on making a nice introduction that's clear, who did you ask to read it to get feedback on it from? You know, where did you get the most useful feedback on improving your proposal text?
For the Marie Curie, Aarhus didn't have a sort of an internal review system, but I did have a point of contact in the funding office, and they read through drafts and gave feedback. And because they run these workshops, you know, the people who work in the office have read thousands of applications. So if there is an option within the host institution of someone who has some experience, because also they can check, you know, lots of it is about why that host institution, they can add things that maybe you didn't know were available. And then I got my PhD supervisor to read it for me, just to check through, because my mentor in Aarhus was obviously more clued into the aspect of the project that I would be trained on there, but not necessarily the science that I was bringing, just to check that that was right and understandable.
Yeah, I think I got a mix of so some of my colleagues who really understood sort of the background, because they were great at picking holes in and saying, hey, you don't explain this well, or don't explain that, or at least, so that certainly both at my the place I was, where I was writing from, or where I would be leaving in Germany, and also at UCL, and as Lucy said, research officers. Also, that they were very helpful with providing previous examples. Even in different topics, it's just like I found that very useful to see how other people had thought to structure their thoughts and their ideas. I found that very useful, even if the topic was completely different, of going, hey, that came across really well, even though I have no clue what they're talking about scientifically. So that definitely helped.
Yeah, I guess a couple of different people, like the most useful comments came from, well, a mix of two sort of peers, basically people in fairly similar situations who were kind of understood about the topic, but weren't necessarily so close because, so they could give a bit of an external perspective, but also people you trust to be able to give you the brutal, honest feedback about what's hopeless and what doesn't make any sense, and you can still stay friends afterwards. And then often, got feedback from more senior people who are sitting on various kind of panels and so forth, not even necessarily for the schemes you're applying for, or they've done that in the past, but people with that kind of perspective who I often found, they wouldn't be like picking apart every bit, but they'd be like, this is fine, this section, redo it completely because you need this information, and that just single piece of feedback can then end up transforming a proposal. So I think those are the kind of two end members, people in a fairly similar situation, maybe slightly more experienced perhaps, but then also people who are looking at it from panel positions.
Yeah, great points. And don't be afraid to get feedback from people, and don't be afraid to completely reorder, rewrite, be brutal with it yourself. It's like when you write a paper and you feel like you feel attached to it, but you're better off being prepared to think that the second or third or fourth iteration that may look really different, may well be far better than that first version, however much effort you put into that very first version. One other question that related to writing and putting together the proposal was along the lines of about figures. Do you have advice for making figures? Should you include figures? What are the best figures to include in a proposal? Again, is that different from in a paper?
They definitely have to be clear, and that sounds maybe silly, but like very well, the point that you're trying to make needs to come across in the figure, potentially even as much as possible without having to read the caption in detail. Like if you can simplify it and sort of bring your point across in a figure, definitely valuable, but maybe try to avoid it being very too technical in a way that you might put in a paper figure where someone might want to spend a long time discussing it or looking at it in great detail. I think you want, at least for me, trying to get figures that have been very more intuitive and less technical would be my advice there.
Yeah, I think I'd completely agree with that, particularly even in the use of kind of like cartoon type diagrams to explain some of the concepts in your research. It can be quite useful to like linking, say, if you've got different objectives or work packages or whatever, like visually showing how they relate in that Earth system, whether that's like a cross section through an ocean or cross section through like a convecting mantle or something. In my case, that helps illustrate the points being made. I guess the other thing I did show was like some handful of like, say, pilot data from, or other data from collaborators or myself, just to to preempt the point of like, oh, you can't possibly do analysis of type A on sample type B because I tried it once in the 1980s and it didn't work, by just being like, look, here's a figure that shows yes, you can do you can do this kind of thing, whether that was like, I don't know, in my case, like a Zane spectrum from a mineral, to show that actually, yes, we can do it. It is these things are feasible, because then you show it and then there's no argument with whether it's feasible or not if you actually show it, I think.
From reading past examples, and then I think the figures I included mainly were around methods. because that was, and that I think I included one because when I was reading past examples from fields that I had no clue about, I found the methods can be quite dry and hard to understand if it's not your field. So if you can simplify that into a figure that someone can see that, this is how it'll work, I found those useful.
Okay, well, we're coming up towards the end. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'd just like to move on to our final section, which is more about sort of advice and resources. So one question is along the lines of what were the best resources or sources of advice that you found when putting together your application? And this is really something that was in, I think there's a question along these lines in the Q&A as well, which is, are there specific places on the internet that are useful to find out about fellowship advertisements?
I know for Germany, the DAAD, I can see if I can find the link, but they have like a search tool that you can put in your career stage and your background and things, and it will give you some results that some may still not always be applicable. I know also UCL, the Women in Earth Sciences group, has actually put together, I think, sort of an overview. I've just posted the link in the chat. That can be a good starting point. Different host institutions will sometimes say these are the fellowship schemes that we are really keen to sort of support. And research officers to get both past examples or be put in touch with past participants. I know, so I know I was able to get some great advice from David Wilson about his experiences applying for NERC IRF as well, and that helped. So, talking to past participants and getting put in touch with them and having connections made through your collaborators would definitely make use of that.
Well, I guess also in the UK, I think you can search through the UKRI website, depending on which fellowships make, because we obviously focus on the NERC IRFs in our discipline, but there are other fellowships which might be relevant. You might be relevant for things in BBSRC or EPSRC or STFC. There are numbers of different things, or other like knowledge exchange fellowships, industrial placement fellowships, and the UKRI website will send you to that. So I also suspect that other national funding bodies will also have this kind of information, say for schemes in the US, for instance. I imagine like NSF might point you towards these things. So think about like the major funding bodies. Most major national funding bodies will have some tool or some relatively straightforward path to finding out what schemes are available in those countries if you find those funding bodies, I think. But you just get the slightly odd random ones in the UK, like the 1851 and Leverhulme and stuff. But I guess contacts in universities can probably point you in the direction of those. And institutional fellowships will often be advertised as jobs on job websites. So like the fellowship that I got from Manchester was just advertised as an academic job, and I saw that, I think, through whatever Earthworks or whatever it is job website. So that wasn't advertised through a fellowship portal, it was advertised through a job portal, even though it was a fellowship, for instance. So sign up for job searches, I think, would be a bit of advice there, even if you're looking for fellowships.
I was quite lucky with the resources for helping writing, because the university held these workshops. But in terms of finding information, it's mainly been through word of mouth. And I think sometimes people feel to be secretive that you're applying, you don't want to tell people you haven't got it, but it's, when you start to tell people, they're like, oh, my friend has one of those, like maybe you could meet them for coffee and have a chat, or I applied, or I have a successful copy of one that maybe I could ask if you could have a look at. So yeah, just talking to people about it, and they'll, sometimes tell you about schemes you didn't even know existed. So I heard about 1851 and stuff, but just from a random coffee with someone who said they were applying, and I'd never heard of it before.
And just very briefly to follow on from that, a lot of university research officers will hold like early career events, well, like these, where they introduce different schemes. So I've gone to several of them. And for myself, I found it very helpful, maybe even to go a little bit earlier than I was thinking of applying, because it gave me some sort of sinking in time to before maybe it started to become crunch time to really put stuff down on paper, but sort of had some time to panic and go, oh, can I do that? Oh yeah, no, I can do that, before I actually had to do that. So yeah, that was worked for me.
Yeah, okay, so start thinking about it before you maybe think you're ready, and give yourself plenty of time and space to chat to people. So if you're not successful first time around, which in most cases people tend not to be with fellowships, how did you deal with that, and how did you go about improving your fellowship proposal?
Yeah, so I was unsuccessful with the idea that I put into the Marie Curie first with these DFG grant fellowships. And I think, so after having a period where I was a bit annoyed first, leaving some space for that frustration to sort of get feedback and try and then see where the idea where else I might be able to apply that idea. And yeah, that year I think I was quite optimistic and only applied for one scheme, and I think from that point on I've tried to adapt ideas to, even if it's maybe the same kernel of an idea, but then adapt it to multiple schemes and have multiple parallel applications, and not put all my eggs in one basket. But yeah, lots of feedback, and then maybe boiling down going back to the idea as a basis, and then seeing, hey, can I add some things or take some things out that were weaker, and build on that and tweak it for different schemes.
I think one of the really great things about Marie Curie is that you get feedback from your reviewers. It can be quite brief, but it also is broken down into those sections that you're scored on. Because like Leverhulme, you just get a sorry, you weren't successful, and you have no idea, was it your idea, was it some, you're not experienced enough, and you don't really know where to start, because you can get feedback but from others, but it's hard to know what exactly went wrong in that application. But yeah, Marie Curie is really good for the feedback, and you can see if say your implementation really let you down, or your impact, and then work on that for the next round.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. Yeah, getting stuff back from Leverhulme, for instance. Yeah, where you get nothing. Because the idea that eventually got funded by NERC was the basis of, I think, 4 previous applications, including to NERC. But then you get some feedback in the reviews, and I guess you still have to view those as a pinch of salt, because say one of the reviews was absolutely massively critical, but then you have to reflect and be like, well, actually, no, I think they were wrong, but it means maybe they didn't understand it. So I still need to work on improving how I express that. And then, yeah, just talking to people, continuing to read around the subject, refine your presentation. But that's the thing, as you said, Anna, I think also the increasing recognition of needing to try lots of different things. If schemes have a 20% success rate and almost all of the applications are good, that means maybe 4 out of 5 applications will fail for essentially random processes. Maybe somebody was slightly better, or something, or something wasn't quite as good as it could be, even though it was already good. A rejection doesn't mean that idea is bad. It often means it was really good, but just not quite good. And don't throw everything out every time you get a rejection, because the likelihood is you're 95% of the way there, which doesn't help when you're running out of contracts and are broke and are trying to work out what you're going to do and where you're going to live, and if you have to emigrate and all this stuff. But the more you can spread that kind of risk, the better, I think.
Yeah, definitely say try not to let it get you down. That's incredibly easy to say, and I've been rejected lots of times and have gotten down, and I all guess get down, but then try not to take it too personally, and pick yourself up and have confidence that trying again, that you should try again. It doesn't necessarily mean that you or your idea are not fundable. It just means that the success rate is small, and you can get unlucky. One bad review, if the reviewer didn't understand it or had, doesn't believe that method is possible, even though it is, then you could just be unlucky, and then you would have better luck next time.
Yeah, so be persistent, and it's definitely not a criticism of you when you're not successful first time round. Just use that as a chance to pick up and improve the next time, I think. So almost at the end, there's one quick question in the chat which I thought I'd just quickly ask in case anyone has any thoughts on this, which is a question along the lines of my background is in analytical chemistry. How could I be involved in applying for a sort of geochemical fellowship based on my slightly different background? So more broadly, we could put that as if your background is slightly diverse and slightly different from perhaps the field in which you're applying, how can you get around that in an application?
I mean, if you think there's also an argument to say you bring a new perspective to a field, and a lot of developments happen at interfaces between different fields. So bringing in a new methodology, or see how you might be able to say, hey, look, this is the skill set that I bring, and it could add this to the topic, or the question that fits more within this topic. I'd say that can be a great strength. I mean, my undergrad was also really broad and whole mix of different things. So I think it can be I think if you have a good idea and your profile can be the right profile to support that, if need be, with collaborators or host institutions that can help strengthen the bits that you have less of a background in, that's can be a really good selling point as well.
Yeah, I think there's lots of schemes that advocate for interdisciplinarity. Like Leverhulme often say that that's their niche of funding, is that they want to fund interdisciplinary projects. And then with Marie Curie too, it's sort of ideal if actually you have skills in a slightly different area and you want new skills. That's what it's designed for.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything specific to add to that, but yeah.
Perfect. So we'll close with a final quick question, a very short answer. Basically, if you could give one final closing tip to someone who's applying, what one thing would you have wished you knew before you set about applying for a fellowship? What would that nugget of advice be?
I think it's what everyone says to you, and I think it's hard to not listen to it, but start early, like start thinking about it. I was really pleased, actually. The workshop I went to in Aarhus was in May with a September deadline, and I thought, this is far too early. But starting just thinking about it then and spending the time, especially if you're doing it on top of a job, to really work on the proposal and give people time to give you the feedback, is definitely worthwhile.
I'd say to see if you can talk to previous applicants and have examples to sort of look at and help give you inspiration. It can be both successful and unsuccessful ones. Both can be quite helpful.
Yeah, and I think my perspective would be like, make sure you're starting from an idea that you believe is interesting and important and exciting, so you're really motivated to follow that idea, and don't get stuck down in the details of what experiments, what analyses you're going to do and how you're going to do them and where. That will fall out easily. You need to once you've got a clear idea of what you want to do and why, I think that's the hardest thing, because otherwise you can end up a bit back to front in how you construct it, I think. So yeah, an exciting idea that you really want to do, basically.
Well, I think that sounds like a really great place to end, and 3 really really great tips for everyone going ahead with research proposal writing or fellowship proposal writing. So yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining as participants. Thank you so much to Lucy and David and Anna Joy for joining us on the panel as well. I think that was hopefully a really useful insights into the successes and failures of writing fellowships, and how that can lead to some really exciting research where you can control what you're doing and be in charge of your own research. So that's really exciting. So I think we'll be taking a little bit of a break in terms of the sort of geochemistry group seminars over the summer, so everyone can enjoy their August holidays. But we'll certainly be back again in the autumn with both ECR skills sessions along these lines. So if you have ideas for things you'd like us to cover, then please just email me. And otherwise, we'll of course have the Out of Academia series continuing as well again. So I think we managed to answer the questions that were added during the session. If any of you did send in questions that we didn't manage to answer, then feel free to go ahead and email me, and I can try and give you some pointers to those if we did miss anything. But I think that's all for now. So thank you very much. Thanks again so much to the panelists for joining us, and hope everyone has a great summer.